He thought I was too quiet to fight back, too soft to ever stand my ground. That night when the plate shattered against the wall and his voice cut through the air calling me useless, I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I didn't even look up. I just took a deep breath, looked at the broken pieces on the floor, and decided right then that I would remember every sharp edge, every cruel word. I would keep them all. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. It truly means more than I can put into words. I wonder where you're watching from right now. Maybe from a quiet kitchen like mine, or a place where the world feels just a little slower. Wherever it is, I want you to know you're welcome here. Now, after that night when the plate hit the wall and the pieces scattered across the floor, I moved slowly, as if every step had weight. My hands steady even though my chest felt tight. I could still hear his voice in my ears, sharp and heavy, and I remember thinking that if I spoke, even one word, I might lose the control I was clinging to. So instead, I kept my thoughts inside, letting them settle like dust after a storm. And I knew that this moment, this night, would not disappear. I would not let it fade into the background like so many other small cruelties I had let pass. This one would stay with me. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the first step towards something they never see coming. Before that night, life had already begun to change in ways I didn't want to admit. When he first retired, I told myself it would be a good thing, that we would have more time together, more mornings with coffee at the table, more quiet afternoons where the only sound was the ticking of the old clock in the hall. But it didn't take long before I noticed the sharpness in his words. At first it was small things, the way he would sigh if I moved too slowly, the way he would watch me and then comment on how I held a spoon or how I folded laundry. He started pointing out the way I buttered toast, as if it were some great failing, mocking my clothes, my pace, my quiet nature. Things that had never mattered before became reasons for him to sneer. I tried to brush it off in the beginning, telling myself he was just adjusting, that maybe the loss of routine had made him restless. But the truth was harder to swallow. The man I had shared decades with was becoming someone I barely recognized. And it wasn't about the toast or the clothes. It was about control, about chipping away at me piece by piece until I no longer felt steady in my own home. And yet I said nothing. I kept setting the table, kept making meals, kept moving around him as if my silence might hold the piece together. I thought that if I stayed calm, he might find his way back to the man he once was. But what I didn't see then was that he had no interest in finding his way back. He was testing how far he could go, how much I would take before I broke. And I learned that sometimes the slowest kind of cruelty is the one that comes dressed as little complaints, spoken in rooms where no one else can hear. And it was that quiet, creeping cruelty that brought us to the night when the plate hit the wall. And I decided that if he was keeping count of my faults, I would start keeping count of his. The night everything tipped over from petty cruelty into something I could never forgive started in the smallest, most ordinary way. I was standing in the kitchen, the air warm from the oven, the smell of roasted vegetables drifting through the house, the table set just the way he liked it, everything in its place. I had been quiet all day, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew the wrong tone, the wrong choice of words. Even a look he didn't like could set him off. And I was tired of walking into storms I didn't cause. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, slow and deliberate, and when he walked in, his eyes swept over the table like he was searching for something to dislike. He pointed at the fork, said it was on the wrong side, then frowned at the way I had cut the bread. His voice sharp as he told me even that was wrong. I felt my stomach knot, but I kept my back straight. I told myself to breathe, to let it pass. But then, without warning, his hand shot out, grabbed the plate I had just set in front of him, and with a quick flick of his wrist, he hurled it against the wall. The sound of shattering porcelain filled the room, sharp and violent, pieces flying across the floor like tiny white knives, food sliding down the paint in slow motion. I didn't move right away. I just stared at the mess, and then at him, his chest rising and falling. His face twisted into something ugly. The words came next, low and cold, telling me I was useless, dead weight, nothing but a burden. The kind of words that land deep and lodge inside you. words that echo long after they've been spoken. I wanted to defend myself, to shout back, to make him feel the sting of his own cruelty. But I knew that was exactly what he wanted. A reaction, something he could twist and throw back at me later. So instead I took a deep breath, bent down, and began to gather the shards, the edges biting into my fingertips as if to remind me to remember this moment. I could smell the vegetables cooling on the counter, hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, small sounds that felt almost too normal in the middle of so much wrong. I wrapped each piece carefully in paper towels and placed them into a plastic zip bag, sealing it tight. Not because I needed to clean up, but because I had just decided that if he wanted to throw pieces of our life against the wall, I would keep them. Every single one. I would keep them until the day came when I could lay them out as proof of what life with him had become. I didn't say a word. I didn't even glance at him again. I simply straightened up, washed my hands slowly, and went back to the stove, as if nothing had happened. But inside, a quiet, steady plan had just begun to take shape, one that he would never see coming until it was too late. The next morning the house felt heavier than it had the night before. The silence between us stretched so far you could almost hear it creak. He sat in his chair with the newspaper open, his eyes skimming the words but not really reading them. I moved around the kitchen quietly, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air, my hands working automatically, pouring his cup the way he liked. 2 sugars, just a touch of cream. He didn't say thank you. He didn't even look at me. And that was fine. I didn't need his words that morning, because my mind was already moving in a direction he could never imagine. The bag of shards was tucked safely at the back of the cupboard, hidden behind a stack of old baking pans he never touched. And every time I passed that cupboard, I felt a strange sort of strength, like I had tucked away not just broken porcelain, but the proof that would one day speak for me. I moved through the day as if nothing had happened, folding laundry, tending the plants, listening to the tick of the clock, letting him believe that the storm had passed. I knew better. Storms like his didn't end. They just circled back when they wanted to. And that night, I decided to add another layer to my plan, while he sat in the living room watching television. I stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner, my phone resting against the wall on the counter, its camera light off, the recorder running. I stirred the pot, my heart steady, listening for the rhythm of his voice. It didn't take long. A small comment about the smell of the food turned into a complaint about my cooking, and then into a sharp remark about how I never did anything right. I didn't respond. I didn't even turn my head. I let the words roll out of him and into the microphone. Every insult, every drop of venom, I let it all collect quietly while I kept moving the spoon in slow circles. And when I served the meal, I made sure it was his favorite, the one that had always made him smile years ago. I placed it in front of him and sat down without a word. He ate, chewing as if nothing in the world had happened, as if he hadn't shattered a plate and called me useless just the night before. And I realized in that moment how easy it was for him to pretend, how practiced he was at wiping the slate clean for himself while leaving me covered in the dust of what he'd done. But I wasn't pretending anymore. I was collecting, quietly building a case without ever naming it as one. And each bite he took that night, each careless glance, each satisfied sigh, was another reminder that he thought I was still under his thumb, still too small to fight back. And I let him believe it, because there is a strange kind of power in letting someone think they are winning. When all the while you're simply making space for the day, you take everything back. I cleaned the dishes slowly that evening, the warm water running over my hands, the clink of plates against the sink steady and soft, my mind already thinking about where I would keep the next recording, how I would store them so they could never be erased or lost. I went to bed that night without speaking a word to him, my phone tucked under my pillow like a secret I would guard with my life, knowing that every insult, every act of cruelty from now on would not just vanish into the air. They would be kept, preserved, and one day they would be the very thing that ended his power over me. Over the days that followed, I began to notice the patterns with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. It wasn't just random outbursts. It was a cycle, One that always started with a small remark, almost like a test. He would watch my face as he said it, measuring the effect, and if I stayed quiet, if I let it pass, he would push further and further, until the words carried that familiar sting, the one meant to remind me that he believed I was beneath him. I started to see it like clockwork, the way the sun sets, predictable, inevitable. But now I wasn't just enduring it, I was studying it. I kept my phone charged at all times, slipping it into my apron, or resting it near me on the counter before he even came into the room, the microphone ready to catch every word, and each time he stepped over that invisible line, each time he let his voice rise or his insults sharpen, I felt a strange calm, because I knew those moments weren't being lost anymore. They were being preserved, frozen in time in a way he couldn't undo. I would cook, clean, move about the kitchen like nothing was different, and he truly believed nothing was. He thought my silence meant defeat, when in truth it was a shield, and behind it I was building something far stronger than his temper. I began keeping a small notebook tucked into the pocket of my cardigan. Nothing fancy, just a worn little book where I'd write the date, the time, and a few words about what he had said or done, pairing each note with the recordings I stored in hidden folders on my phone and on a small flash drive I bought one afternoon when I told him I was just going out for milk. That trip to the store was the first time in months I felt like I was walking towards something rather than just moving through my days. The air outside was crisp, and I remember taking the long way home, letting the wind brush my cheeks, my mind racing with possibilities. I hid the flash drive in the lining of an old sewing box that had belonged to my mother, a place I knew he'd never look. And from that day forward, each insult, each burst of anger, each time he threw something across the room or slammed a door, I saved it. Sometimes late at night, when the house was still, I would listen to the recordings, not to torture myself, but to remind myself that I wasn't imagining it, that I wasn't too sensitive or too thin-skinned, that these moments were real and cruel and undeserved, and that one day they would become the proof I needed. There were times, sitting in that quiet kitchen, when I felt a deep ache in my chest, thinking about the years I had spent trying to make things right, trying to keep the peace, how many birthdays I had planned for him, how many meals I had made, how many times I had stood in his shadow because I thought love meant sacrifice. But the more I recorded, the more I wrote, the less that ache felt like loss, and the more it felt like resolve. He had no idea what I was doing. No idea that every casual cruelty was being stored away in a place he could never reach. And that was my advantage. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving him, I was preparing for the day I'd be free from him. And when that day came, I intended to be ready in a way that left no room for doubt. Not for the police, not for the courts, and certainly not for him. Weeks passed, and with each one I felt myself changing in ways I never expected. It wasn't the kind of change you see in the mirror. It was quieter, deeper, the kind that settles into your bones until it feels permanent. I had gone from bracing myself for his outbursts to anticipating them. Not in fear, but in readiness, like a soldier who knows the battlefield too well to be caught off guard. I moved through each day with a deliberate calm, keeping my voice even, my face neutral, my movements steady. And while on the surface it might have looked like I had simply given up, the truth was that I was holding the reins now. Even if he didn't know it, every word he threw at me, every sneer, every belittling remark was another brick in the wall I was building. A wall of evidence, one he wouldn't be able to climb over or knock down when the time came. I had grown skilled at capturing everything without drawing attention, sliding my phone into place when I heard his footsteps, turning my body so my hands could shield the small red light if I had to press record quickly, even finding ways to position the phone near him without him noticing. A book left open on the table, my cardigan draped over a chair with the phone tucked deep in the pocket. Sometimes the recordings would pick up the sound of my knife on the cutting board, or the water running into the sink. Those small domestic sounds framing his voice like a reminder that this cruelty wasn't happening in some heated public moment. It was happening here, in the supposed safety of our home. And that made it all the more powerful. The contrast between my stillness and his chaos told a story all by itself. But the recordings weren't my only weapon. The bag of shards had grown heavier since that first night, because the plate wasn't the last thing he threw. There were mugs, a small dish, even a glass once. Each time I picked up the pieces with the same steady hands, wrapping them carefully, labeling the date in that small notebook before sealing them away, I had created something he would never understand. A silent archive of his own violence. Each fragment a physical reminder of the way he tried to chip away at me, and yet it was his own temper that was cutting his future apart, one piece at a time. I sometimes wondered what he would think if he knew. If he could see the care I put into saving what he had destroyed. But I never lingered on the thought, because I knew the power of this plan came from its secrecy. There were moments when he would look at me across the table, suspicion flickering in his eyes for just a second, as if he sensed something shifting. But then he would dismiss it, confident in the belief that I was still the same woman who swallowed her words and carried on. That overconfidence was my shield, and I let him keep it. The irony was almost sweet, because while he believed he was wearing me down, I was in fact becoming stronger, more certain, more prepared for the day when I would no longer have to live under his roof or his rules. And I began to picture that day in detail, not as a dream, but as an inevitability. A moment that would come not with a burst of anger or a slammed door, but with the quiet presentation of undeniable truth, the kind that leaves no space for denial, no room for twisting the story. And until that day came, I would keep moving through my routines, pouring his coffee, setting his meals, letting him believe the surface was smooth, all while underneath, I was weaving together the threads of his own undoing. The more time passed, the more precise I became in gathering what I needed. It was no longer just reacting when his temper flared, it was anticipating it, setting the stage so that when he showed his true self, every detail would be caught and preserved. I learned the rhythm of his moods, like I had learned the changing seasons over the years. The way his voice would shift when he was restless, the pacing of his footsteps when irritation was building, the way he would sigh before finding something to criticize, and I would be ready, phone in place, notebook nearby, my mind sharp even if my face was calm. I knew when to speak just enough to keep him talking, because the recordings were never just about the words, they were about the tone, the venom hidden in a raised voice or a mocking laugh, the way his cruelty could drip into an ordinary sentence until it became something far uglier. I made sure my own voice stayed steady, soft, so that the difference between us was clear. And the truth was that every moment I captured made me stronger. Not because I wanted revenge in the loud, dramatic way most people imagine, but because I knew that when the time came, I wouldn't have to argue. I wouldn't have to defend myself against his charm in public or his practiced lies. I could simply press play, and the truth would speak louder than anything I could ever say. The bag of shards was tucked away safely, heavier now, lined with layers of paper and quiet patience. Each broken piece labeled in my small, neat handwriting with the date and what had happened. Sometimes I would take the bag out late at night when the house was silent, running my fingers over the wrapped shapes. Not in sadness, but in a strange kind of resolve, because each one meant I had survived another moment where he wanted me to crumble. And instead of crumbling, I had taken something from it, something that would one day protect me. I even began to photograph the places where the plates or mugs had hit, small chips in the paint on the wall, faint scratches on the floor, tiny details he would never notice, because he never cared about the aftermath. Only the explosion. I stored these photographs in a hidden folder on the flash drive, alongside the recordings and the digital copies of my notes. And I backed them up in a place he could never reach. I started to feel like I was living two lives, the one he saw and the one I was building quietly. The one he saw was the same woman who kept the house running, cooked his meals, moved around him without protest. But the life I was building was one of careful preparation, a life that would not be defined by him forever. And there were moments, brief but powerful, when I would look at him across the table and feel nothing at all. No fear, no sadness, no love. Just the knowledge that I was already halfway gone. and that what was keeping me here now wasn't weakness but strategy. He still didn't suspect, because in his mind I was incapable of such planning. He believed his version of me so completely that it never crossed his mind I could be gathering the kind of proof that could tear down everything he thought was secure. But I was. And with each passing day, I was closer to being ready, closer to the moment when I would take all of these pieces, every word, every shard, every photo, and place them in the hands of someone who could make sure he never had the chance to hurt me again. I didn't know exactly when that moment would come, but I knew it would. And until it did, I would keep living in this quiet space between his outbursts, holding my calm like a weapon, and letting him believe he was in control, while all along, I was the one holding the future in my hands. I sat there that night, the soft hum of the fridge filling the quiet while the rain tapped steadily against the window, and I let my mind wander through every detail of the last few days. I could still see their faces in my mind, the way they had avoided my eyes, the way their voices had turned sharp when they thought they were being firm. But underneath their words, I could hear the fear. Fear of what my presence meant. Fear of the weight they thought I carried into their perfect little world. I remembered the last time we all laughed together, years ago now, when life still felt like family meant more than convenience, when they looked at me and saw love instead of an obligation. That memory hurt the most because it reminded me of how far we had drifted, and how quietly it had happened, almost without notice, like the slow cooling of a fire that no one bothers to feed. I thought of all the moments I stayed silent, all the times I swallowed my pride to keep the peace, and how they had mistaken my quiet for weakness. But as I sat there with my hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold, I realized that silence, when chosen, can be more powerful than any shouted word. And in that silence, I began to see a path, one I had been hesitant to walk, but now it felt almost natural to step forward. The next morning, I woke with a sense of calm that surprised even me. The rain had cleared, leaving the air crisp and bright, and the light poured in through the curtains, as though the world itself was trying to nudge me toward action. I moved through my home with deliberate care, opening drawers, pulling out papers I had kept tucked away for years, each one holding a piece of the life I had built before they started rewriting my place in it. I found old photographs, legal documents, and letters, reminders of my worth, my rights, and the roots I had planted long before they had the audacity to question my presence. As I laid everything out on the table, I felt a steadiness rise in me, a reminder that while they might see me as a burden now, the truth was far from it. Every paper I touched carried the weight of my years, my sacrifices, and my quiet planning. It was not anger driving me anymore, but a deep, steady resolve that had been forming in the shadows for far too long. I realized then that I didn't need to shout, didn't need to demand, didn't even need them to understand. I only needed to move in my own time, on my own terms. Days passed, and I carried myself as though nothing had shifted, greeting them with the same small smile, letting them believe I was still where they had placed me in their minds. But every evening when I was alone, I worked on what needed to be done. I made phone calls, signed papers, arranged meetings, and slowly, a picture began to take shape, a future they hadn't even considered possible. The sweetest part was knowing they would never see it coming, that by the time they realized what I had been doing, the pieces would already be locked in place. I didn't rush it. I let each step unfold naturally, the way one tends to a garden, knowing that the harvest comes not in a day, but in its own season. I thought often of the moment it would all come to light, how their expressions might change, the way the air in the room would shift when they understood. And yet, I didn't plan for a scene or a confrontation. That wasn't my way. No, my satisfaction would be in the quiet unveiling, in the knowledge that I had reclaimed my place without begging for it, without lowering myself to their level. One evening, as I watched the sun sink low and paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I felt the last thread of hesitation loosen and fall away. I knew then that the work was done, that everything was ready, and all that was left was to let it play out. I poured myself a fresh cup of tea, sat by the window, and thought about how life has a way of showing you who people really are, Not in the loud, dramatic moments, but in the quiet choices they make when they think no one is watching. They had shown me theirs, and I had answered with my own. The difference was, mine came with years of patience, of knowing when to hold my tongue and when to make my move. And now, as the last of the light faded, I could almost hear the faint echoes of the moment ahead, when their certainty would crumble and they would have to face the truth. That the person they thought they could sideline had been holding the pen the entire time, writing an ending they never expected. I didn't need to rush toward it. I would let it come, steady and sure, just like the dawn. I stood there in my doorway that morning, the air cool and still, watching the first light spill across the street like a quiet promise. Everything I needed to do was already done. The papers had been sent, the calls had been made, and the wheels had been turning without them even realizing it. Somewhere, at that very moment, they were waking up to the reality I had built. A reality where I was no longer at their mercy, where their control had slipped through their fingers without a single raised voice or open fight. I thought about how many nights I had stood in that same spot, feeling small, unseen, and unheard, convincing myself that silence was survival. But this silence was different. It wasn't the quiet of defeat, it was the quiet of certainty. Every detail had been considered, every loose end tied, and every step taken with care. I didn't need to see their faces when they realized what had happened. I could imagine it well enough. The disbelief, the scrambling, the dawning understanding that they had underestimated me for the last time. I felt no urge to gloat, no desire to see them beg. My victory wasn't in their downfall, it was in the life I had reclaimed, in the control that now sat firmly in my own hands. I had done what I needed to do without becoming what they were. That's the part they will never understand. That strength isn't in shouting or breaking, it's in knowing you can stand on your own, without their approval, without their permission. The sun was higher now, painting the street in gold, and I stepped inside, closing the door with a calmness that felt like the final chapter in a story I had been writing for far too long. I knew there would be new days, new beginnings, and I was ready for all of them. If you've ever taken back your power, whether in a small way or a life-changing one, I'd like to hear about it. Share your story in the comments, or simply write, "I took it back." And if you believe in standing up for yourself with grace and dignity, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Your support here matters more than you know, and together, we can keep these stories alive.